My husband's mistress made a shocking announcement. She didn't know I own the company. My name is Willow Wright, though not for much longer than 10 minutes ago. I watched my husband of 10 years announce our separation by letting his mistress reveal their engagement to a room full of our business partners, clients, and friends. If you're wondering how someone could possibly orchestrate such a spectacularly humiliating moment, let me paint you a picture of the most cringe-worthy anniversary dinner in the history of corporate betrayal. But here's the thing they don't know yet. I've been waiting for this moment for 3 years. And Oliver Wright, the man who thinks he built an empire, is about to discover that he's been nothing more than a very expensive puppet in a show I've been directing all along. The Meridian Club's private dining room was decorated with white roses and crystal, elegant, expensive, and completely wasted on what was about to become the most embarrassing display of midlife crisis behavior I'd ever witnessed. Oliver had insisted on hosting our 10th anniversary celebration here, claiming he wanted to share our joy with the people who matter most. I should have known something was wrong when he invited Elena Torres. Elena was our head of marketing, a stunning brunette in her late 20s who wore power suits like armor and had the kind of ambitious gleam in her eyes that made smart women nervous and stupid men delusional. She'd been working closely with Oliver for the past 6 months on what he called strategic initiatives, though the only strategy I could identify was her systematic demolition of professional boundaries. Ladies and gentlemen, Oliver stood at the head of the table, his face flushed with what I'd initially assumed was champagne, but now recognized as the glow of a man about to commit social suicide. Thank you all for joining Willow and me for this special evening. I sat at his right side, wearing the sapphire necklace he'd given me that morning, a gorgeous piece that had probably cost more than most people's cars. My smile was perfect, practiced, and completely genuine. Because I knew something Oliver didn't. This necklace had been purchased with company funds through an expense account I'd been monitoring for months. 10 years, Oliver continued, raising his glass. A decade of partnership, growth, and... He paused dramatically, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Transformation. Around the table, our guests smiled politely. There was Marcus Chen, our biggest client, Sarah and David Goldman from Goldman & Associates, Tom Bradley, our CFO, and 6 other couples who represented the cream of our professional and social circles. All of them were about to witness what would either be the most romantic anniversary speech ever or the most public character assassination in Denver business history, based on the way Elena was fidgeting with her champagne flute and avoiding eye contact with everyone except Oliver. I was betting on the latter. Marriage, Oliver said, his voice taking on the pontificating tone he used during board meetings, is about growing together, about recognizing when 2 people want different things and having the courage to pursue their individual happiness. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. Willow, he turned toward me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood pressure spike while my face remained serenely composed. Has been the perfect supportive wife. She stood behind me through every challenge, every triumph, every late night building this company from nothing into the success it is today. Stood behind you, I thought. Oliver. Darling, I've been pulling your strings so hard you should have rope burns. But sometimes, he continued, life presents us with unexpected opportunities for new partnerships. That's when Elena Torres stood up. I watched in fascination as she cleared her throat, smoothed her red dress, and looked around the table with the kind of nervous confidence that suggested she'd rehearsed this moment, but hadn't quite anticipated how awkward it would feel in practice. I know this might seem surprising, Elena began, her voice slightly higher than usual, but Oliver and I have found something special together, something that transcends the professional relationship we started with. The silence around the table was so complete, I could hear the ice settling in water glasses. Marcus Chen's fork was halfway to his mouth, frozen in midair. Sarah Goldman's face had gone through several color changes and settled on a shade that reminded me of raw salmon. We've fallen in love, Elena continued, apparently committed to this train wreck now that it was in motion. And we wanted to share our happiness with the people who matter most to both of us. She reached into her purse, a Hermes bag that I now realized had probably also been purchased with company funds, and pulled out a small velvet box. Oliver proposed to me last night, she announced, opening the box to reveal a diamond ring that was both stunning and familiar. And I said yes. The familiar part was what made me want to laugh. That ring had belonged to Oliver's grandmother, and according to the will I'd helped him navigate when she died 3 years ago, it was technically part of the marital assets that would be split in a divorce. Elena was literally wearing my jewelry to announce her engagement to my husband. The reaction around the table was everything I could have hoped for if I'd been directing this scene myself. Marcus Chen actually dropped his fork. David Goldman started choking on his wine. Tom Bradley looked like someone had just told him the company's books had been audited by the IRS and found lacking. But the absolute best part was watching Oliver's face as he realized that his dramatic moment wasn't playing quite the way he'd scripted it. Instead of gasps of delight or congratulations, he was getting stares of shock, disapproval, and what appeared to be second-hand embarrassment. "Willow," Oliver said, turning back to me with forced brightness, "wanted to be the first to congratulate us, didn't you, darling?" Every eye in the room turned toward me. This was my moment, the moment when I could either break down in tears, cause a scene, or do what I'd been trained by my father to do in situations like this, smile graciously and let my enemies destroy themselves with their own stupidity. "How thoughtful of you both to share your news in such a public way," I said, my voice warm and completely composed. I raised my champagne glass in what looked like a toast, but felt more like a declaration of war. To new partnerships and unexpected opportunities. I took a sip of champagne and smiled at Elena with the kind of genuine warmth that probably made her wonder if I'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown. Because here's what Elena Torres didn't know: I'd been recording every conversation between her and Oliver for the past 4 months. I had copies of every email, every text message, and every fraudulent expense report they'd filed together. I knew about the corporate credit cards they'd been using for their romantic getaways, the company funds they'd diverted to pay for Elena's apartment, and the insider information Oliver had been sharing with her about upcoming mergers. More importantly, Elena Torres had no idea that the woman she'd just publicly humiliated was actually her boss. Let me tell you something about Gordon Hall. My father. That most people never knew he was a paranoid genius who trusted no one completely, including his own son-in-law. When he died 5 years ago, leaving me his shares in Hallwright Industries, he didn't just leave me money, he left me insurance. The will that Oliver and everyone else saw gave me 30% of the company. Enough to be wealthy but not enough to have control. What they didn't see was the secondary trust, the shell corporations, and the private equity firms that had been quietly purchasing additional shares over the past decade. Dad had been planning for this possibility since the day I married Oliver. Men like Oliver, Dad had told me 2 weeks before he died, are useful until they're not. They're good at playing CEO, while someone smarter handles the real decisions. But power corrupts, and when Oliver inevitably decides he's outgrown his usefulness to our family, you'll need to be ready. Ready turned out to be an understatement. Through Belmont Capital Holdings, a firm Oliver had never bothered to research because he assumed it was just another investment group, I controlled an additional 22.5% of Hallwright Industries, combined with my inherited shares. I owned 52.5% of the company Oliver thought he was running, for 5 years. I'd been the silent architect of every major decision, every acquisition, every strategic move that had built Oliver's reputation as a business genius. He thought he was playing chess while I'd been directing the entire game from behind the scenes. And tonight, watching him hand Elena Torres my grandmother's ring while announcing their engagement at our anniversary dinner, I decided it was time to step out of the shadows. Hallwright Industries occupied 43 floors of Denver's most prestigious office building. What Oliver didn't know was that there was a 44th floor, accessible only through a private elevator, that required both a keycard and biometric scan. Dad had built this space as his personal command center, and I'd been using it for the past 3 years to monitor every aspect of the company's operations. I took the elevator to the 44th floor at 11:47 p.m. Exactly 2 hours after Oliver's spectacular public betrayal. The hidden floor looked like something out of a spy movie: banks of monitors, secure communication systems, and enough surveillance equipment to make the NSA jealous. My two trusted confidants were already waiting for me: James Morrison, Dad's former head of security who'd helped design this facility, and Margaret Chen, my personal attorney who'd been quietly managing my shell corporations for years. Both of them had watched Oliver's announcement via the live stream I'd arranged to be secretly recorded. "Well," James said with grim satisfaction, "he certainly didn't disappoint. I don't think I've ever seen someone torpedo their own career with quite that much style." Margaret was less amused. "Willow, are you absolutely certain you want to do this now? Once we start this process, there's no going back. Oliver will be professionally destroyed, and Elena Torres will never work in this industry again." I thought about Oliver's face as he'd announced our separation, the casual cruelty of letting his mistress deliver the news, the humiliation of being publicly discarded in front of people whose respect I'd spent a decade earning. "Margaret," I said, settling into the chair in front of the main control panel, "I've been planning this contingency for 3 years. Oliver just gave me the perfect justification to execute it." I began typing commands into the system, activating protocols that would begin the process of reclaiming my company. Within minutes, every computer terminal in the building would be locked down, every financial account would be frozen pending security review, and every door would require new authorization codes that only I possessed. "James, please initiate a complete system lockdown. I want everything secured until further notice." "With pleasure," James replied, his fingers flying over his own keyboard. "What about Oliver's access codes?" "Revoked, effective immediately. Same for Elena Torres and anyone else who's been using company resources for personal gain." Margaret pulled out a tablet and began pulling up files. "I've been compiling evidence for months, just in case. We have Elena's emails discussing insider information, Oliver's signatures on fraudulent expense reports, and audio recordings of them discussing upcoming mergers with competitors." "How much are we talking about in terms of embezzled funds?" I asked. "Conservative estimate $2.3 million over the past 18 months. They've been using company credit cards for everything: vacations, Elena's apartment, jewelry, even the engagement ring Elena was wearing tonight." I laughed, though it came out sharper than I'd intended. "Oliver proposed to his mistress with a ring purchased using my money. That's either ironic or just pathetic." "It's evidence," Margaret said pragmatically. "Along with everything else, it paints a clear picture of systematic financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty." The monitors around us displayed real-time feeds from security cameras throughout the building. I could see Oliver's office, still dark, and Elena's workspace in the marketing department. By tomorrow morning, both spaces would be cleared out and their access revoked. "What's our timeline?" I asked. "Emergency board meeting can be called for 9 a.m. tomorrow," Margaret replied. "I've already drafted the agenda and supporting documentation. We're alleging financial misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of company ethics policies." James looked up from his monitors. "Building security is now under your direct control. Oliver's keycard access has been revoked, along with Elena's and 3 other employees who've been flagged for suspicious activity." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Denver's skyline. Somewhere out there, Oliver was probably celebrating his newfound freedom with Elena, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse around him. "Gentlemen, lady," I said, turning back to face my team. "Tomorrow morning, we're going to remind Oliver Wright that he never actually owned anything. He was just borrowing it." The boardroom on the 40th floor had been the site of countless meetings where Oliver had played the role of visionary CEO while I'd fed him talking points from the shadows. Today, he walked in expecting to discuss restructuring the company leadership following our separation, completely unaware that he was walking into his own professional execution. I arrived early, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that radiated authority and carrying a leather portfolio that contained enough evidence to destroy several careers. The board members filtered in over the next 15 minutes, 7 outside directors. Tom Bradley, our CFO, and Elena Torres, who'd apparently been invited by Oliver to discuss transition planning. Elena looked nervous, but tried to hide it behind professional confidence. She'd chosen a conservative blue dress and minimal jewelry, probably advised by Oliver to dress down after last night's spectacle. Oliver himself arrived precisely at 9 a.m., wearing his most expensive suit and the kind of confident smile that suggested he thought this meeting was a formality. "Good morning, everyone," Oliver said, taking his usual seat at the head of the conference table. "Thank you for accommodating this emergency meeting. As you all know, Willow and I have decided to end our marriage, and we need to discuss how this will affect company operations." "Actually, Oliver," I said, standing up with my portfolio in hand, "this meeting has been called to discuss financial irregularities and potential fraud that have been discovered during a routine security audit." The change in room temperature was almost physical. Elena went pale. Oliver's confident smile faltered. Tom Bradley suddenly looked very interested in his coffee cup. "I'm sorry, what?" Oliver asked, his voice taking on the sharp edge it got when he was trying to regain control of a situation. "Margaret Chen, representing Belmont Capital Holdings, has compiled evidence of systematic financial misconduct involving multiple company employees," I continued, nodding toward Margaret, who began distributing packets of documents to each board member. "What you're looking at," Margaret said in her crisp attorney voice, "is documentation of $2.3 million in fraudulent expenses, insider trading violations, and breach of fiduciary duty spanning the past 18 months. Oliver stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward. "This is ridiculous. Willow, what are you trying to pull here?" "I'm not pulling anything, Oliver. I'm presenting evidence to the board of directors, as is my fiduciary responsibility as a major shareholder." Elena finally found her voice. "This is obviously some kind of vindictive response to last night. Willow is trying to use her position to—" "Ms. Torres," I interrupted, turning to face her directly. "I'd like you to explain this email." I placed a printed email on the table in front of her, watching her face as she read her own words back to herself, a detailed message to Oliver discussing which clients would be most affected by the upcoming Morrison merger, information that wouldn't be public for another 2 weeks. This was sent to Oliver 3 days before he purchased stock options in Morrison's primary competitor. I continued. Options that netted him $340,000 when the merger was announced and competitor stock prices spiked. Oliver's face was cycling through several shades of red. Those were legitimate investment decisions based on market research. Market research. I placed another document on the table. Or inside information provided by your marketing director, who had access to confidential merger documents through her work on the transition planning committee. Margaret took over the presentation with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months. She walked the board through email after email, expense report after expense report, building an airtight case of financial misconduct that left no room for interpretation. "The engagement ring Ms. Torres was wearing last night," Margaret said, projecting a receipt onto the conference room's main screen. "Purchased with company funds through Oliver's executive expense account, listed as client entertainment." Elena looked like she might be sick. Oliver had moved past red and was approaching purple. "Elena's apartment lease," Margaret continued, "has been paid for the past 8 months through Wright Consulting, a subsidiary company created specifically to hide personal expenses. The vacation to Maui last month company credit card. The Tesla in Elena's parking space company fleet vehicle assigned to Oliver but driven exclusively by Ms. Torres. By the time Margaret finished her presentation, the board members were staring at Oliver and Elena like they'd just discovered a pair of embezzlers, which, technically, they had. Oliver, said Rebecca Morrison, the board's senior independent director, do you have any response to these allegations? Oliver looked around the room like a cornered animal, his eyes finally settling on me with an expression of pure hatred. This is a setup. Willow is obviously fabricating evidence because she's angry about our separation. Oliver, I said, standing up and walking to the head of the conference table where he'd been sitting, I'd like you to look at this document. I placed a legal filing in front of him, watching his face as he read the header, Disclosure of Beneficial Ownership, Belmont Capital Holdings. What is this? He asked, though his voice suggested he was beginning to understand. That's documentation showing that Belmont Capital Holdings owns 22.5% of Hallwright Industries, in addition to my inherited 30%, which means I own 52.5% of this company. The silence in the room was deafening. Oliver read the document twice, his face going from purple to gray to a sickly green that reminded me of old sea foam. You own, he started, then stopped, reading again. I own controlling interest in Hallwright Industries, I said clearly, making sure every board member heard me. I am, legally and practically, the majority owner of this company. You, Oliver, have been acting as CEO at my discretion. Elena Torres made a sound like a deflating balloon. Tom Bradley dropped his pen. Rebecca Morrison leaned back in her chair with an expression that suggested she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about corporate power structures. For the past 5 years, I continued, I've allowed you to operate as CEO while I managed the company's real strategic decisions through shell corporations and private investment firms. Every major acquisition, every significant hire, every strategic partnership has been orchestrated by me and my team. Oliver tried to stand up, swayed slightly, and sat back down. That's impossible. Gordon left me 30% in the will you saw. He left me control of the company through private trusts and investment vehicles that you never bothered to investigate. I walked around the table, letting this revelation sink in while Oliver tried to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. Every board meeting where you presented your ideas, I wrote those presentations. Every client you successfully wooed, I arranged those introductions. Every strategic decision that built your reputation as a business genius, I made those decisions. Elena Torres finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You let us think Oliver was in charge. I let Oliver think he was in charge, I corrected. You were never supposed to be part of this equation. I turned back to Oliver, who looked like someone had just explained quantum physics to him in ancient Greek. Oliver, you've been a frontman, a very well-compensated frontman, but ultimately just a figurehead for decisions I was making behind the scenes. And now that you've decided to publicly humiliate me and commit financial fraud with your mistress, I'm taking back direct control of my company. The board vote was unanimous. Oliver Wright was suspended pending a full investigation into financial misconduct. Elena Torres was terminated immediately for breach of fiduciary duty and corporate ethics violations, within 3 hours. Building security had escorted both of them from the premises with boxes containing their personal effects and strict instructions never to return. I watched from the 44th floor as Oliver stood on the sidewalk outside the building, still holding his cardboard box and staring up at the Hallwright Industries sign like he was trying to understand how his name had gotten attached to a company that was never actually his. Elena Torres had disappeared entirely. Her office was cleared, her corporate accounts were frozen, and her access to company information was permanently revoked. I heard through industry contacts that she'd quietly left Denver. Though whether she'd been forced out or simply couldn't face the professional embarrassment was unclear. By the end of the week, The news had spread throughout Denver's business community with the speed and thoroughness of a particularly juicy scandal. Wright Industries CEO suspended for financial misconduct was the headline in the Denver Business Journal. Hidden heiress takes control of Hall Wright empire was how the Colorado Economic Times chose to frame the story. But my favorite headline came from Forbes, The Silent Architect, How Willow Hall Built an Empire from Behind the Scenes. The article detailed not just Oliver's downfall, but the revelation that I'd been the actual strategic mind behind Hall Wright Industries' success. Reporters had somehow discovered the existence of Belmont Capital Holdings and traced its ownership back to me, painting a picture of a brilliant businesswoman who'd been content to let her husband take public credit for her private decisions. The response from the business community was overwhelmingly positive. Clients who'd assumed they'd been working with Oliver Wright suddenly understood why their strategic initiatives had been so successful. They'd actually been working with me all along. Through carefully orchestrated intermediaries, Marcus Chen, our biggest client, called me personally to request a meeting. "Willow," he said. "I always wondered why Oliver's presentation sounded different from his casual conversation. Now I understand why you were writing them." "Marcus," I replied, "I've been managing your account personally for 3 years. The only thing that's changing is that you'll be dealing with me directly instead of through Oliver." "Good," he said emphatically. "I'd rather work with the architect than the building inspector." 3 weeks after taking official control of Hall Wright Industries, I found myself sitting across from Amanda Richardson, CEO of Richardson Global Industries, discussing a merger proposal that Oliver had arrogantly dismissed 6 months earlier. "When Oliver rejected our initial proposal," Amanda said with barely concealed amusement, "he told our team that women don't understand the complexities of corporate mergers. I'm assuming you feel differently." I couldn't help but laugh. "Amanda, I've been orchestrating corporate mergers for 5 years. Oliver couldn't structure a merger if it came with step-by-step instructions and a team of consultants." "That's what I suspected," she replied. "Our due diligence suggested that Hall Wright's actual strategic decisions were being made by someone with much more sophisticated financial understanding than Oliver demonstrated in meetings." The merger discussions moved forward with remarkable efficiency, partly because Amanda and I shared similar visions for expanding into emerging markets, and partly because both companies had been essentially managed by women who understood the value of collaboration over ego-driven competition. "This merger," Amanda told me during one of our strategy sessions, "will create the largest female-owned corporation in Colorado history. And," I added, "it will increase our market share by 340% while maintaining our commitment to ethical business practices." The Richardson Global merger was announced 6 weeks after Oliver's suspension, creating a combined entity worth $2.8 billion and employing over 15,000 people across 3 countries. The business press called it the deal of the decade, praising both companies for their innovative approach to international expansion and sustainable business practices. Oliver, who was reportedly working as a business consultant for a small firm in Colorado Springs, was quoted in one article as saying the merger was a mistake that will prove costly within 2 years. Industry analysts disagreed, with most predicting continued growth and expansion for the newly combined company. I didn't waste energy gloating over Oliver's predictions. I was too busy implementing the expansion plans he'd never understood and building the international partnerships he'd been too short-sighted to pursue. My father's original office had been on the 42nd floor, a massive corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows and enough room to host board meetings. When Oliver took over as CEO, he'd moved into this office and converted it into what he called his executive suite, all black leather, chrome fixtures, and modern art that looked like someone had thrown expensive paint at a wall. The week after the merger announcement, I had Oliver's decorating choices removed and began restoring the space to its original character. Dad's mahogany desk came out of storage, along with his leather-bound first editions and the vintage globe that had fascinated me as a child. The walls were repainted in warm cream instead of aggressive black, and the floor-to-ceiling bookcases were restored to hold actual books instead of decorative objects. But the most important addition was the portrait gallery I installed along the eastern wall, photos of every major project Hallwright Industries had completed over the past decade, along with discrete plaques identifying the actual strategic architect of each success. Oliver's name appeared exactly nowhere. I also converted the adjacent conference room into what I called the Strategy Center, a working space where department heads could collaborate on long-term planning without the formal intimidation of traditional boardroom environments. The walls were covered with whiteboards. The furniture was modular and comfortable, and the coffee was significantly better than what Oliver had provided. "This feels like a real working office," said Jennifer Walsh, our new head of marketing, during her first week. Oliver's space always felt like a movie set where important business was supposed to happen, but never actually did. "That," I replied, "is because Oliver was performing the role of CEO instead of actually doing the job." The legacy office became the heart of our company's new culture: collaborative, transparent, and focused on results rather than appearances. I held open office hours every Friday afternoon where any employee could bring ideas, concerns, or suggestions directly to me without going through multiple layers of management. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Employee satisfaction scores increased by 78% in the first quarter after Oliver's departure. Project completion times decreased by 23%. Client retention improved to 94%, the highest in our company's history. More importantly, the intellectual energy in the building was palpable. People were excited to come to work, eager to contribute ideas, and confident that their efforts would be recognized and rewarded based on merit rather than politics. 6 months after reclaiming control of my company, I was ready to launch the project that would become my greatest professional legacy, the Gordon Hall Foundation for Women in Business. Dad had established a charitable foundation years before his death, but it had been largely dormant under Oliver's management, mostly writing checks to established charities without any strategic vision or measurable impact. I restructured the foundation to focus specifically on supporting young women from marginalized communities who were pursuing careers in business, technology, and entrepreneurship. The foundation's flagship program was a comprehensive mentorship and funding initiative that provided not just financial support, but strategic guidance, networking opportunities, and ongoing career development for women who traditionally faced barriers to business leadership. Too many women are told they don't belong in boardrooms. I explained during the foundation's launch event, speaking to an audience of community leaders, potential donors, and program applicants. They're told they don't understand finance, they're not aggressive enough for sales, they're too emotional for executive decisions. The Gordon Hall Foundation exists to prove those assumptions wrong. The foundation's first cohort included 25 women, ages 22 to 35, representing diverse backgrounds and business interests. There was Maria Santos, a first-generation college graduate who wanted to start a sustainable food distribution company. Jennifer Kim, a software engineer developing accessible technology for disabled users. Sarah Thompson, a former teacher creating educational programs for underserved communities. Each participant received not just funding, but personal mentorship from successful businesswomen, access to professional development workshops, and connections to potential investors and partners. Most importantly, they became part of a network of women supporting other women's success. When I was starting my career, I told the first cohort during their orientation, I thought I had to choose between being successful and being authentic. I thought power meant becoming like the men who held it before me. But real power means changing the game entirely. The foundation's impact was measurable within months. 12 of the first cohort's businesses secured additional funding within 6 months. 8 were featured in local and national media as examples of innovative entrepreneurship. 3 were acquired by larger companies, with the founders staying on as executives. But the metric I was most proud of was this: 100% of the foundation's participants reported feeling more confident about their ability to succeed in business. And 92% said the program had connected them with a community of women they could rely on for ongoing support and guidance. The transformation of Hall-Wright Industries and the launch of the Gordon Hall Foundation had apparently made me something of a business celebrity. I began receiving invitations to speak at conferences, universities, and corporate events, opportunities to share not just my success story, but the lessons I'd learned about strategic thinking, authentic leadership, and the power of patience. My favorite speaking engagement was at the University of Colorado's Business School, addressing a lecture hall full of undergraduate women who reminded me of myself at their age: ambitious, intelligent, and completely unaware of their own potential. "How many of you have been told you're not aggressive enough for business?" I asked, watching hands tentatively rise throughout the auditorium. "How many have been advised to change your communication style, your appearance, or your personality to fit into corporate culture?" Nearly every hand went up. "Here's what I wish someone had told me at your age," I continued. "You don't need to become someone else to be successful. You need to become completely yourself, but strategically." I told them about my years of staying in the background, letting Oliver take credit for my ideas while I built real power behind the scenes. I explained how I'd learned to use other people's underestimation of me as a strategic advantage. "There's a difference between being invisible and being underestimated," I said. "Invisible means no one sees your value. Underestimated means they see you but misjudge your capabilities. Underestimation is a weapon if you know how to use it." The Q&A session lasted nearly an hour, with students asking everything from practical questions about career strategy to personal inquiries about maintaining authenticity in competitive environments. "Ms. Hall," one student asked, "do you ever feel guilty about letting your husband take credit for your work for so long?" I thought about this question for a moment, considering not just the answer, but the lesson it represented. "Guilt implies I did something wrong," I replied. "I made a strategic choice to build power quietly while allowing someone else to be the public face of that power. When that person betrayed my trust and abused his position, I had the tools and evidence necessary to reclaim what was rightfully mine." "So you planned for him to betray you?" "I planned for the possibility that he might. The fact that he did so publicly and spectacularly just made my response more dramatic than it might have been otherwise." After the presentation, a young woman approached me with a question that surprised me. "Ms. Hall, when people introduce you now, what do you want them to call you?" I realized that this was the perfect summation of my transformation. For years, I'd been introduced as Oliver Wright's wife, or Mrs. Wright, or occasionally Willow Wright, representing Hall-Wright Industries. My identity had been defined in relation to other people rather than by my own accomplishments. "Call me Willow Hall," I said. "No qualifiers, no explanations, no references to anyone else, just Willow Hall." A year after Oliver's spectacular self-destruction and Elena Torres's quiet disappearance from the business world, I found myself in a position I'd never quite imagined: completely, authentically myself, with the power and platform to make that authenticity meaningful. Hall-Wright Industries had become Richardson Hall Global, a multinational corporation known for innovative business practices, ethical leadership, and the kind of long-term strategic thinking that creates sustainable success rather than quarterly profit spikes. Our employee retention rate was the highest in our industry. Our client satisfaction scores were unprecedented, and our profit margins had increased by 67% since Oliver's departure. The Gordon Hall Foundation had expanded to include programs in 3 states, supporting over 200 women entrepreneurs and creating a network of successful businesswomen who actively mentored and supported each other's continued growth. I'd been featured on the cover of Fortune magazine as one of America's most innovative CEOs, profiled in Harvard Business Review for my approach to collaborative leadership, and invited to speak at the World Economic Forum about sustainable business practices. But the moment that felt most like victory wasn't any of those professional accolades. It was last month, when I ran into Oliver Wright at a charity auction. He was there with a woman I didn't recognize, apparently. Elena Torres had been replaced by another ambitious young professional who saw Oliver as a stepping stone to success. He looked older, grayer, and somehow smaller than I remembered. "Willow," he said, approaching me during the cocktail hour with the kind of forced friendliness that suggested he was hoping for a civil interaction. "You look successful." "I am successful, Oliver. I always was. You just never noticed." He laughed uncomfortably. "Well, congratulations on everything. The merger, the foundation, all of it. Very impressive." "Thank you." We stood there for a moment. Two people who'd shared 10 years of marriage but had apparently never really known each other. "I have to ask," Oliver said finally. "Did you plan all of this? The evidence, the board meeting, everything?" I considered his question carefully, thinking about my father's lessons about strategic preparation, about the 3 years I'd spent documenting Oliver's increasingly risky behavior, about the moment I'd decided to stop hiding my capabilities. "I planned for the possibility that you might someday value your ego more than your marriage," I said. "I planned for the possibility that power might corrupt your judgment. I planned for the possibility that you might try to humiliate me publicly. And if I hadn't, then you'd still be CEO. And I'd still be your silent partner. But you did. So here we are." Oliver nodded slowly, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd thrown away for a younger woman and a few $1 million in embezzled funds. "For what it's worth," he said, "I never meant to hurt you." "Oliver," I replied, "intent matters less than impact. You tried to humiliate me publicly, and instead you gave me the perfect justification to stop hiding my power. In a way, I should thank you." As I watched him walk away, rejoining his new girlfriend at a table far from the stage where I'd be giving the evening's keynote address, I realized that my story wasn't really about revenge at all. It was about reclamation, reclaiming my identity, my power, and my right to be seen as the architect of my own success rather than someone else's supporting character. Tonight, when I was introduced as the keynote speaker, the announcement would be simple: "Please welcome Willow Hall, CEO of Richardson Hall Global and founder of the Gordon Hall Foundation." No references to my former marriage, no explanations of how I'd achieved my position, no qualifiers or context needed, just my name, my accomplishments, and my voice, for a woman who'd spent years letting other people write her story. That felt like the greatest victory of all. "My name is Willow Hall. I built an empire while everyone was watching someone else, and now, finally, I'm holding the brush."